100 years ago, the small town of Rosewood, Florida was a thriving black community. Rosewood had its own baseball team, several black churches, and black-owned businesses. But in January of 1923, at the height of the lynch mob period, Rosewood, Florida would never be the same.
So it didn't take much to incite the riot. And so I was told that there was a mob already in some of the neighboring towns and communities because a white woman had claimed that she had been raped by 8 African-American men. And so when the word spread to them about Rosewood, that's all it took.
It was basically a week of horror.
Fled into the woods here, the swamps. It was cold. She said it was like 13, 14 degrees. She said the ground was like frozen. And you see the palm trees here. That's what they use to try to stay warm, and some of the leaves on the ground.
In the aftermath of the massacre that was built on a lie, 6 black citizens lost their lives while survivors evacuated by train into Gainesville. To add insult to an unrepairable injury, a 1923 grand jury found insufficient evidence to prosecute any of the white men responsible. This left survivors of Rosewood to grieve in decades of fear and silence.
And I know coming up as a kid, I would go outside, go on the porch where my grandmother would be sitting on the porch, and she would be sad a lot, crying. And I said, "Why are you so sad, Grandma?" She said, "I don't want to talk about it."
For 50 years, the people who survived Rosewood lived under a vow of silence. They did not talk about it outside of the family at all.
And then when she broke down and told me about Rosewood, and she said, "You need to prepare yourself," because there was a documentary that was coming out of on 60 Minutes with Ed Bradley.
The 60-minute segment in 1983 brought national attention to the Rosewood Massacre, but it wouldn't be until 1992 that Arnett Doctor, the grandson of a Rosewood survivor, would embark on a path to justice by working with law firm Holland & Knight.
Arnett went and laid the case out. Arnett had did a tremendous job as far as connecting all the dots. The family members, property owners, he had found birth certificates, death certificates. I mean, he was a walking Rosewood.
He's the one who we considered to be our primary client. He was the glue that held it all together.
A lot of the family members didn't want to talk about the story of Rosewood. They had vowed to take it to their grave, even my grandmother. They were upset with Arnett.
When deciding whether to take the case, it was the honesty and strength of Rosewood survivor Minnie Lee Langley that sealed the deal for attorney Stephen Hanlon.
She was really open about what happened. She remembered everything. And she was like 8 or 9 years old, and she remembered everything.
And he said when he had talked to Minnie Lee Langley, she had solidified the story because she was straightforward with him about what happened. And that was a winning factor for him from an attorney standpoint.
The Rosewood case was then brought to the Florida legislature in the form of an equitable claims bill.
They're not used often, but primarily they are situations where a citizen has a claim against the state of Florida for a personal injury or damage based on acts or failure to act by the state.
These people had lost property. They were law-abiding citizens, but they didn't get the protection that they, should have gotten.
After the claims bill was presented, the Florida Speaker of the House commissioned an academic investigation. The study was led by FSU historian Dr. Maxine Jones.
At the time, I had no idea that this was as big as it was, that our research would play a major role, and that this would set a precedent, in a sense.
The report that was created was so substantive, so significant, that it became the platform on which we refiled the bill in 1994.
In the closing debates on the controversial House bill came a string of public testimonies. For the first time, Rosewood survivors spoke directly to the state about the trauma they endured as children and the life that was taken from them.
Nobody in that room had any question about the legitimacy and the importance of what we were doing in the legislature.
It was mostly Arnett, my mom, my Aunt Vera Hamilton, and all the survivors who went before the legislature to tell the story. Minnie Lee Langley, Mr. Hall, him and his sister Mary Hall, my great uncle Willie Evans.
Michelle Williams recalls the testimony of her grandmother, Minnie Lee Langley.
There's a photograph of her after she testified, and you know, on the stage she was real tough, but then after she testified, she went back and took her seat and she just broke down in tears.
For the elderly ones, I think for the survivors, they finally had a chance to tell their story and have people listen. That was important.
On May 4, 1994, Florida Governor Lawton Chiles held a ceremonial signing of House Bill 591, surrounded by Rosewood survivors and families. The Florida governor remarked that through this legislation, Rosewood will never be forgotten.
This is, even though it was a tragedy, it's still history, and the fact that it even came out was a miracle in itself.
It meant a lot. It was not about the money. It was about them acknowledging what had happened.
The bill is the only one in the country to ever compensate African Americans for racial violence. The state paid Rosewood survivors for property loss and emotional damages, set up a scholarship fund for descendants, promised that Florida law enforcement would further investigate the massacre, and require that the Rosewood Massacre be taught in Florida classrooms.
The real legacy, I think, of Rosewood is that the governmental entities, for the first time, took responsibility for what happened.
We all have history. We all have a story. It's our job, our responsibility as survivors, descendants, to make sure that our children know what our family before us went through.
I'm Haley Seibert reporting.